Hello and welcome. Welcome back to What Would Jesus Tech? I am Andrew. I'm joined by Joel. I'm joined by Austin. We are doing this again. Who knows? Maybe we'll even be weekly soon. What we're doing in this podcast, and we are helping you use tech, find rest, glorify God. We're helping builders and creators like ourselves build technology as Jesus would if he were to live today. And so today we're going to talk about social media. In particular, we're going to talk about the algorithms that inform your social media for you tabs, because there's been some very significant recent events that legally will completely change the landscape of social media going forward. Austin, did I say that right? Correct me.
You did,
How would you
yes.
define the importance of this?
I would say that while there is still a lot up in the air and the legal process is still in motion, like nothing official has been decided yet that is lasting and binding and permanent, enough significant momentum has taken place to where if this continues on the trajectory that it's on, we're looking this sounds like a hyperbole, but I'm being serious. We are looking at the end of the internet as we have known it these past 20 years, and we are entering into an entirely new frontier of what the internet and everything on the internet is going to be.
Because the question is, how much can governments tell Google or Facebook, Meta, or X, Twitter, how much can governments influence what is posted or what shows up in your For You tab? So we all are familiar with the algorithm. And this all kind of starts with a story. So consider this 10-year-old girl named Nyla. She is on a phone. She is looking at this phone, and she's on TikTok. Now, TikTok, if you're not familiar, you open up the TikTok app, you see a video immediately when you sign on to the app, and you can swipe. And every time you swipe and do something on the app, you will see one thing or another thing, and it takes whether you like something, whether you pause and watch a video, it will take all the information that is gathered and it will send you certain videos based around that algorithm that determines what they think you will like to watch and continue to watch. What happened to Nyla is that she watched videos, or at least one video, of the blackout challenge. The blackout challenge was you use a belt or a rope or something, you tie it around your neck, and you make yourself unconscious and faint, and then you post this video online. In the case of Nyla, she died. Her parents found her. They found out what happened. And now there is these two sides. There's TikTok or BitDance or ByteDance, whatever is the parent company. And there is this Anderson on the other side of it. And there is this legal battle now in order to say, hey, is Anderson right in arguing that TikTok is at fault for showing her the video? Or is the person who created the video at fault or something like that? Who is at fault? And so what Anderson accuses, is that no, TikTok promoted this video to Nyla, and they cannot be relieved by or like unburdened. They cannot release their culpability. That's a technical moral language for saying, are you responsible for this wrongdoing? Are they culpable? Well, one of the ways to get away from this was 230. And this gets technical, but this is important because it's like 230 could see a huge shift. What is 230 and why? How does that relate to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate what you said about culpability, because I think something that we need to be emphatic on is that regardless of what is decided legally in terms of who is legally at fault and the remedies that stem from that, this is TikTok's fault. This would not have happened without TikTok. Period. End of discussion. This is TikTok's fault. We can get into the legalities of remedies all day long, but you take TikTok out of the picture and this doesn't happen. It's just that simple. But as for Section 230, I'll read from 47 USC Section 230. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So, in simple terms, no provider of a service on the internet is held responsible for things that other people may say or do in that space by virtue of them facilitating that content to exist. In more practical terms, Facebook or X or Instagram or Reddit, you can pick any website that you may want. They're not responsible for things other people say in a comment section as original content, just by virtue of them hosting that speech. They do not. They don't share any liability. They don't share any legal culpability. Where the Section 230 issues come into play with this particular case, though, is that when Section 230 was first drafted, it was drafted in the 90s, before social media existed, before internet algorithms as a thing. The way that we use the internet was just wildly different. And Joel can probably speak very well into that. He was telling us before the call about just some fascinating research and experiences he got to have with like the origins of Wi-Fi, and it's awesome. But the internet was wildly different then. Now, though, we have these spaces, these social media platforms, where the content that's hosted there isn't distributed the same way content was hosted and distributed when Section 230 was first created. Now we have these intermediaries called algorithms that are products produced by each social media platform. These algorithms are not the same as each other. They don't operate the same way. They emphasize different things. And these algorithms reflect what each social media company is choosing to prioritize, choosing to incentivize, choosing to reward, and what it's choosing to suppress or downplay or moderate. The beauty of Section 230 is that publishers or internet providers can not be held responsible for the content that's hosted on their platforms, but they still retain their ability to moderate that content without liability. So it all comes to a head here, where the content that this little girl saw came because TikTok's For You algorithm, as a product that TikTok creates, told her or recommended to her this specific speech over other kinds of speech. So the algorithm is acting as an agent of TikTok promoting this particular speech. An analogy that we could maybe run with comes from David French on Advisory Opinions. He had, I think, a great analogy in describing this in non-technical terms. If someone came to a little kid and sat next to the kid, at a school lunch table or at a park bench or whatever, and said, "Hey, I know you. I know what you like. I know what you're interested in. I've got a video that I think you're gonna like." And guy pulls out his phone and shows the kid this video, and it's violent, pornographic, disturbing. We wouldn't fault the guy for creating the video. He may not have. It may have gotten the video from somewhere else.
Right.
But he absolutely chose to approach this kid, say, "Hey, I know you like this. I know this is what you want." It's not what the kid wants. It's dark and terrible and traumatizing and horrible, and the kid absolutely didn't ask for it, but still subjected that kid to that content anyway.
Right. Yeah. I'll pass it over to Joel after I just make this comment that our current state of affairs with social media and other algorithms as well is that these big tech companies have control but no responsibility.
That's exactly right. Yep.
They have control over what you see. They have control over the degree to which you see pro-China content or anti-China content, the degree that you see viral stuff across the web versus family stuff that might be from your uncle that you don't like. And so they give you more and more stuff based around what they control for their purpose, for their pocketbook, without the responsibility of your anxiety because of the app, your depression because of using the app, your whatever, all of these other things, and we've seen, Zuckerberg, they can call Zuckerberg to the stand and blast him, but they will not be able to send him to jail because Zuckerberg can say Section 230 gives me permission to do this. Control, but no responsibility.
Yeah, so I think, the comment mentioned earlier, and this is probably where it gets tricky, is if you kind of conceive when Section 230 was first put in place, right? So we're at the foundations of the internet, and there are companies who are creating the backbone of how data is translating across the web, right? There's we were talking earlier about Wi-Fi, and that's a protocol that everyone just uses to connect your phone to a router, get wireless data, and that's a protocol that someone created. Now, it wouldn't make sense exactly to say that, okay, now the person who created that protocol that communicates the data is culpable for any data that goes across that, right?
Right.
Because it's similar
Yeah.
to this is a infrastructure, this is utility. It's like the paper that a bad article is printed on. You're not going to go to the paper manufacturer and be like, hey, you
Yeah.
created this paper, now you're culpable because something was bad on that medium. And then, so now the world is connected. And even now you take it to the next level. Think about how North America is connected to Europe. We have these deep sea cables. And those deep sea cables don't actually connect to every person. They connect to one site, or a couple big sites where all the data from a continent or from a country is aggregated. So actually the way the data flows is already in a sort of structure. And if you have a website that you're visiting, it will actually, there's now another algorithm above it that's going to say, hey, instead of just showing you the website from UK, I'm going to show you the website that's coming out of New York because you're closer to New York than UK. So now this algorithm is doing a little bit more intelligence and serving you data because of your geography. So there's like this, first step on like, okay, we know something about your geography. We're going to serve you something. It's better for the infrastructure. It's better for how the world is connected. So over time, you have more and more companies adding to the stack over the past 20 years. And that's where these big tech companies have made what we're calling applications on top of that underlying internet. And sure, maybe in the earlier days, there might have been someone who sat behind a computer and said, okay, I understand how this algorithm works. I'm going to show you this content and I'm going to put my editorial stamp on that. I think the challenge now is that these algorithms aren't explicitly saying, I'm going to show you this bad content. It's more, I'm going to show you what is viral in people in your age demographic, or what is relevant because other people have spent time watching it. So you're not actually saying what is the content. You're using proxies to determine what is interesting, right? So I think, for example, the Blackout Challenge, just as this, how does anything get viral, right? People are watching it, people are sharing it, people are doing it, and that becomes a snowball. That the people who created the TikTok platform may not even be immediately aware of until it kind of crosses a threshold to be like, hey, FYI, these are the top trending things right now. And that's where it kind of comes to the control aspect you mentioned, where it's like, okay, if you see something is trending that is like maybe crossing a line, do you then have, or should you, take it down? And I think that does happen, right? There are moments where people are like, okay, now like put your thumb on the scale. But it's gonna be, this is the tricky part, because if Section 230 gets completely repealed, now you're saying if you don't put your thumb on the scale, you're gonna get sued.
Right.
And there are some pretty clear black and white examples that we as a society can all agree, like, look, this is violent, this is not good. But then where is going to be the
The gray
line
area.
on,
Yep.
hey, you're actually like, I don't agree with your opinion, so your
Right.
view is harmful. Your view on Christianity, that is harming my child who shouldn't see anything that's Christian related because you're imposing that view on them. And now I'm
Right.
going to say like, hey, you can't post Christian content, right?
Right. Yeah.
So there is this challenging path without deeply thinking about what's a superior law. that will end up making it so that they can't create an algorithm. So then you'll just get low quality content. You'll just get like whatever's randomly there. And that might be an argument to be like, yeah, don't just whatever people post, just show it to me. But in that case, you
Back
might
to the
actually get
YouTube
worse
original
content.
days.
I was about
Yeah.
to say, back to reverse chronological feed, baby.
Yeah, imagine. No, well, and Joel, you brought up something there, like in the, like, and we'll link to it in the show notes. It's like 35 pages, like this Anderson versus BitDance or whatever, versus TikTok, essentially. They say we reach this conclusion when they're deciding, when the legal team is deciding on the judge, whatever. I don't know, this is in the States, so I'm not as familiar. We reach this conclusion specifically because TikTok's promotion of a blackout challenge video on Nyla's FYP for you page was not contingent upon any specific user input. Had Nyla viewed a blackout challenge video through TikTok's search function rather than her For You page, then TikTok may be viewed as more of a repository of third-party content. Given the type of algorithm alleged here, we need not address whether Section 230 immunizes any information that may be consumed. And then they also go on further to say that they believe that TikTok did know that the blackout challenge was viral, and they did know Nyla's age when using the app. You know, that these things add to that culpability. It's not that they can say, well, we didn't know if it was a mature individual who understood the risks inherent with this kind of viral activity. Are we allowed to watch other people passing out? Like, I actually remember when I was in grade 6, me and a bunch of other boys, we would try to make ourselves pass out. Like,
yes.
It was
stupid boy stuff. Stupid boy stuff. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Totally. I remember it. And I remember being in the classroom and like one kid was like really good at it. And so he would make himself pass out. And I guess, yeah, that's around 10 years old. So I remember like not being able to do it myself and like not really wanting to commit to it and being scared because obviously this is risky, but he would put his hands around his throat and he would make himself pass out and he'd be fine. So I'm just trying to like, obviously you hear different things. There's like viral Red Bull videos of people doing crazy stunts, you know, and it's like, obviously you shouldn't try that at home, but people still do. And as soon as you show those kinds of videos, so yeah, you're bringing up this question of this gray scale kind of stuff, which I think is important. We need specific laws. Like, I think this is where the Old Testament laws are helpful because you have specific laws on certain things, like Deuteronomy 22:8. I'll read it in the New Living Translation just so that it's easier to understand. When you build a new house, you must build a railing around the edge of its flat roof. Like that idea that, okay, if you're going to build this public good because they would walk along the roof of people's houses, well, put a railing on it. Now it was a parapet. It wasn't that high of a railing. So, you know, you don't need to go and build a wall right on the edge of your house, but you need to build some infrastructure for the public good. There needs to be, when you're building something that's in the realm of public use, it needs to have certain things to accommodate, or, you know, as affordances, as you know, Joel, and Austin, affordances, those design elements in a society that lead toward certain outcomes. In the same way you design an intersection so that the reason why you're seeing more roundabouts in your city than just intersections between two major roads is because they've studied, roundabouts afford individuals to slow down. They might have more bumper to bumper collisions, but less casualties, less death because of the lesser high impact. So there's all these design decisions, and algorithms are, of course, a design decision that affords certain things more than others. And this affects, like, we don't have to go there yet, but like, this affects algorithms all over the place. Uber's algorithm is a very important algorithm. Yeah. The algorithm of how you are, the calculation on how much it costs to get from one place to another, the calculation on how much the driver is paid, because they are considered contractors. And so therefore they are, you know, independent contractors, but they have no control over the price it's the algorithm that has the control over the price. Well, that's just the middleman. It's a proxy, says, Uber, so it's again, it's using this proxy, but these proxies, the railings on our houses, are our responsibility too, right?
Right.
The railings that we build, the things that we put in public spaces, as companies, as individuals, as a society, we are culpable for our actions there as well. We can't just wash our hands clean. And this is really why, like, one of the reasons why we have this podcast is to think through these issues as Christians who have a moral framework guiding us, rather than just, some consequentialism or some, like, other ethical system that
Mhm.
might not have the virtue ethics, the rules, the whole host of ethical principles from Scripture.
And I think it's worth bringing up, like you talk about, like designing for like public good in mind, like as being like the center of gravity for design choices. Like we have to set that against, like, what is the center of gravity for the design choice of these algorithms right now? Well, it's the same as any business product. It's designed to
Right.
maximize shareholder value, and the way social media companies do that is that the chief end of all social media is to sell advertisements, and that's what these algorithms are for. They're mediums for advertisers to sell advertisers to get their products or their services purchased. For Uber, their algorithm is maximizing shareholder value by manipulating price wages and shorting drivers of what they're owed for their work. These design choices all funnel down to what is incentivizing the most amount of money for us, which in the case of the For You page and a piece of trending content, you know, how much money did something like the Blackout Challenge make TikTok as a revenue generator? We can look at Facebook in 2016 as they were expanding into Myanmar, not just expanding the platform's availability, but funding internet infrastructure, providing cell phones,
Mm-hmm.
like literally from the ground up, building a digital infrastructure in a company or in a country that didn't have one up until then, turns a blind eye to the genocide that begins to be perpetuated by Myanmar's junta military government through the platform, because it has a financial incentive to keep as many people on this platform using these services as possible. That's what the center of gravity is. And so the parapets, the rails for social media companies, like they may build rails, and we need to acknowledge too that, like, Facebook spends a lot of money paying a lot of contractors sub minimum wage to scrub the true worst of the worst content from Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
There are some horrible stories of content moderation farms, and uh,
Yeah.
the people doing the guardrail work, keeping us from seeing beheadings and murders and all sorts of horrible stuff that gets uploaded on a regular basis. So even if they were to build these walls, even if they were to build these things to try to reinforce public good, so long as the center of gravity remains what it is, these things are going to happen again.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, it's definitely very challenging. So I do agree. For example, with the parapets, it's like there is, especially when you're doing a public service, there is a duty to build scaffolding, to build protective systems, so that people don't get hurt. And I think, I mean, there's two angles I kind of want to think about it. Is one, um, I agree they have a liability, but also, in the case with TikTok that we're talking about, what about the parents' responsibilities
Oh
to
yeah.
protect
Oh
their child,
yeah.
right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think oftentimes it can be like, well, I'm not gonna worry about my kid. I'm not gonna put these restrictions and say, hey, you're this age, you can't go on TikTok. And I think, there's another article recently to say that they're planning to put an age limit, to say you can't access TikTok if you're not this old. And I think, yeah, like oftentimes people can forfeit their responsibility to be parents. Be like, hey, like the
Mm-hmm.
system is going to, and blame the system. And I don't think that's the right path, because it really then, yeah, just like leaves these vulnerable sector of people to whatever is out there. And like you said, people might even be trying their best to prevent these things
Yeah.
from going through the net, but things will go through the net, right? And if
Yes.
it's not an acceptable risk, we should have like, hey, laws that protect, the vulnerable sector. And the other kind of tangent is if you have an area where someone is using electricity to make weapons, let's just say, like taking it completely to a random direction. Do you hold the utility liable for providing electricity, right? They're incentivized to say, hey, we're going to get paid to deliver this electricity. And maybe even if they knew that it's like electricity is being used for a bad thing, should they be shutting off electricity, right, to that location? So I think it's a stark kind of comparison of like, what are we really asking the utility providers to do, and at what level do they have enough information to even make that judgment, right? So maybe they have an inkling of like, this may be bad, so now we're going to shut it off. But then if they don't make that decision, then they're going to be held liable later. So now their incentives are like, let's just be safe. Let's just shut everything off because it's going to be more expensive to fight the lawsuits. And then we just end up with these like really restrictive platforms that restrict free speech.
Right. And that's why if any change happens to Section 230, whether it is outright repealed, which I don't think it will be. I think that would be a genuine apocalypse if that happened. Something in between that would be a more likely result. But even if anything changes to it, this is the air that everyone has been breathing when it comes to the internet ever since they started using it. Like, we literally do not know of an internet, or could not think of an internet, without Section 230 being the foundation for it. And as scary as it sounds, so much good has come from Section 230 along from so much evil. We all have jobs in tech and media because of the things that Section 230 allowed it to be created and developed and markets to emerge. And all of these things that bring flourishing and benefit and provide people to be creative and use their talents for the good and the benefit of others. What if the alternative is worse? Like, what if an alternative to Section 230 ends up actually making the good things worse and doesn't actually solve the problems?
Yeah.
Right. And there's kind of the argument of how do you assess the moral formation inherent in a market? A market is a two-sided area. You think of a farmer's market. You have people selling, you have people buying produce at a farmer's market. Okay, well, you can think of a lot of these online platforms as markets. Glenn Butner Jr., he's recently written a book called Work Out Your Salvation, a theology of markets and moral formation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that he notes in that book is that our interaction with markets is morally formative. Like, it does affect us. And one of the things that he tries to make clear in the book is that there's often this like, oh, there's a socialism on one side or a capitalism on the other, and which do you choose? As if everything easily falls within those two poles.
Right.
And it's like, no, that's impossible. You take the most capitalist society you can ever imagine, the freest markets that you can ever imagine, where the invisible hand does all the work. And even there you had regulation. Like, just no matter what, it might not have been called regulation, but there are certain things that were incentivized.
It was
and
de facto regulation. Like, it may not have had the name, but it was still doing the same thing.
That's right. And you have certain moral qualities that end up becoming either cultural norms or regulated in some particular fashion, and it gets regulated. And so we can't just sit on our hands and say, well, capitalism brought a lot of economic prosperity, so I guess we just need everything to be free. Nor can we say we just need the governments to have more power, because that also has some difficulties. We just need to think thoughtfully about, the principalities, so to speak, like Butner uses some interesting imagery from Ephesians to say, there's these systemic sins, or if you can even think of them as sins, because normally we think about culpability being on an individual level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we think theologically about sin, we can't really say that America is culpable for sin, or that company is culpable for sin, in the same way that we can attribute that to individuals who made those individual choices and are accountable before God. Because the clear testimony of Scripture is that each one of us stands before God for our actions. And
Right.
yet there is something to be said for these laws that guide and form people in certain ways, in sinful ways, like these principalities kind of do, or something. He doesn't use the language and define it clearly, but he just kind of teases it out as there's something here, there's some kind of systemic things, there's some kind of cultural things, there's some, when it's a policy that clearly introduces sin into a society, that's an issue.
Right.
And that's at minimum, it's a product of the fall. And so we live in this time of both common grace and fall and depravity. And so that's what we see in our laws. We see in Section 230 itself, we see, oh man, wasn't this a wonderful thing that led to a lot of flourishing innovation? And yet we also see some of that innovation having that sin embedded within it.
The principalities language is probably the most neglected category of, not just even like as a theological category. It's paramount to Paul's writing, but it's something that most Western Christians are very underdeveloped on. But it's even more underdeveloped when it comes to things like application to markets, or to tech, or to cultural forces and things like that. We just don't think in those ways. And there's an example from John Steinbeck's classic novel, The Grapes of Wrath. I had to search for the quote just to make sure I got it right.
I only know the VeggieTales version, the grapes.
This is not the
Wrath.
VeggieTales. This is not the VeggieTales version. I love that version. This is definitely not the same thing.
Okay.
Where it's Great Depression America, a farmer that has suffered multiple crop failures is going to lose his farm. The bank is going to come and foreclose on his farm, and he and his family are going to be landless and destitute. And as the representative from the bank shows up and is formally kicking them off, the farmer asks the man, why are you doing this? Like, why are you know what's going to happen to us? You know that you're basically like leaving us to die. Like, we will have nothing if you take this farm from us. Why are you doing this? And the guy from the bank responds, I'm not the one doing it. This is what the bank is doing. That this is what the bank has said has to happen. And talking about the bank as this third party entity, basically. And the farmer responds, well, the bank is just made of men. It's comprised of men. It's the decisions of men. Like you are the bank. You are part of the bank. And this is where I had to search for the quote to make sure I got it right. The banker responds, the bank is something more than men, I tell you. It's the monster. Men made it, but they can't control it. As being this principality and power that swallows up and destroys everything. And when it comes to algorithms, the exact same thing is true. Like, men made it, but we can't control it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good quote, especially as it segues to what I wanted to bring up with where this is going next, right? I think,
Right.
From the conversation so far, we can definitely agree that, like, okay, some repeal and modifications to Section 230 can be made and would result in potentially a better society. We can't just sit back and be like, well, we can't do anything about it. We should take the time, think about it, and figure out how to improve it. What makes it more complicated, though, is that it's coming at a point in the technology cycle where we are just introducing artificial intelligence. Right. And, like just yesterday, OpenAI came out with their new model, Strawberry or O1 or Q-Star, whatever it was called. And what it's doing is allowing the model to do some more thinking first. And maybe I should just do a quick summary of what this change meant. Is like, before you would ask it a prompt and it would just execute. And now it's actually going to think about what you're asking and then plan what should I do? So you're giving a little bit more in terms of the brain, like a prefrontal cortex. Typically the problems in the past is you would ask it a complex problem, but it wouldn't know how to break it down into smaller steps and break that problem down and then solve it. So you could ask it to like code a game, for example. Now it could be like, well, coding a game is actually comprised of all of these sub functions and all these steps and do that thinking. So we're still, on this 5-stage curve of AI development. We're probably in stage 2. And, stage 3 is a little bit more refined in how it thinks. But how this relates to algorithms in Section 230 is you'll get to a point where this entity, this AI agent, is now serving content. And men have made it, but it is
Cannot control it.
men. We cannot control it. It is in itself its being. So now how do we assign, restrictions and blame and stuff like that? And I think my immediate thought is the first thing we could do is at least say like, hey, yeah, there's restrictions on who can engage with it, because it is a dangerous being, right? I think that's something wise to say. Like, if you are young, if you are not of mental capacity, you should not be allowed to engage with it. Just like we have nuclear controls or even weapon controls, it's like there is like a bar for you to engage with it. That I definitely think is one thing we can do. Because there are frameworks on how you deal with dangerous things.
Yeah, that's why we shouldn't elect presidents that don't have a high degree of mental capacity. But
endorsed. I fully endorse that take.
No, you're bringing up some good thoughts, Joel. I'm not going down a presidential commentary. There's plenty of podcasts for that. But no, I think this is complicated. It seems to, in Canada at least, one way that this is playing out is with Bill C-11, which was basically a bill by Trudeau to say, I'm going to tell algorithms who distribute content, whether you're YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any distributor of content, in the same way that the government 30 years ago told radio stations to have at least 20% of songs that are Canadian, so too the YouTube algorithm should send out through their algorithm Canadian content without clearly defining Canadian or anything like that. And the bureaucrats have been very slow to implement this law. It passed, but they've been slow to implement the law. They've created this whole timeline for further consultation, and the timeline very nicely goes beyond when Trudeau will likely be kicked out, and conservative government, based around polling, they're like 10 points ahead of the Liberals right now, and they'll likely get voted in, get a majority, and they will repeal this law very quickly. And so you won't have Bill C-11 have any act on any Canadian other than a bunch of bureaucratic paperwork that maybe the bureaucrats knew better, and they're like, oh, this is really hard to implement, and how do we define Canadian? And apparently we need to make sure it's Aboriginal content, but how do you define that? Because that's very controversial. And so it's just like not actually going to move forward. And so this is just where we're at as a society, is how do you handle the wild west of the internet? It's kind of like they note in this policy back and forth that it kind of started in 1991 when it was like first starting with the internet even being created and used more publicly. Like that kind of set the standards for these ethics for 30 years. Like, isn't that wild? Like 1991, those ethics created there like end up moving forward. It's in like one of the footnotes of this policy. But now we're kind of like, okay, we can't just have what existed then. We are in a new state now with new AI. You have different AI types of things getting regulated in Europe. Of course, North America being a little more anti-regulation, we're not seeing as much. So it'll be interesting going forward. I have no predictions, but we will see. Any final thoughts from you two guys on what we should do as Christians?
This is where I find, as someone who works with algorithms for a living, there's another quote in the Grapes of Wrath section that I read a second ago that I resonate with just so very deeply, where from the banker, it happens that every man in a bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. Which, as a social media manager, I feel deeply in my bones of like everything, like everything that I hate what I do in terms of playing with these powerful destructive algorithms, and yet it's also the algorithm's fault. And this is where I find significant comfort for me in the day-to-day in the providence of God over the principalities and powers, over the empires and kingdoms of the world, whether they be political kingdoms or technical kingdoms, that we don't get to control the times and places in which the Lord has stationed us, but he has not abandoned us to be he's not abandoned us to try to glorify him in our own strength in these dark places. And so whatever the landscape may look like, our first response always needs to be, we have to renew and confirm and strengthen our confidence in the power of God to work even in the darkest of places. Because if we don't have that confidence, we're going to look at the present situation, the future situation, and we will despair, and we will be overcome with fear about what will happen to us. But if God is truly in control, we can work in these spaces and be in these spaces, knowing that he is with us and will work all things for his glory and our good.
Yeah, no, I think that's really encouraging. And I think, part of implementing that is being like, okay, knowing first, like starting with that foundation, be like, God is in control. Okay, what has he enabled me to do? How can I, in my domain, set the boundaries, the parapets for my family, for my community, right? And start there and take some steps to be like, look, we need to educate our children about the risks. We need to maybe in our community have these standards, and then have that bubble up, right? As like our communities and groups coalesce into larger bodies, that I think we can make some positive changes to say, look, like, okay, this is a red line, that enough people have clearly said is not beneficial for our souls, for society, for humanity, for our soul. And yeah, it's encouraging to be like, yeah, do not give up the good work and wallow in despair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there needs to be a two-pronged approach, or maybe three-pronged. One is at the level of your individual household and family. One is at the level of political engagement and policy, which I feel some Christians, they have been falsely taught that Christianity ought not speak into the political realm, as if, that doesn't matter, or as if, it's more of an Anabaptist thing, really, and a misunderstood Baptist thing of a separation of church and state means the separation of any thoughtful critique or engagement with the political realm. You can't avoid politics. It's just the nature of life. As soon as you live and you walk down the street and someone tells you to use a certain gendered pronoun or not, your response to that is a political act. We're political creatures, as Aristotle might say. Anyways, so three prongs. First, your family. Second is political engagement. But third is prayer, up to God. That if we have those three prongs and we are active in each, then there's much hope, and we will figure this out going forward. And I'm sure God will be in control.
And
Go ahead.
And we'll be surprised too at what God can do even through these things. I mean, we can look at the biblical narrative and see near the end of the exile that the way that the people of God return to their homeland comes from the Persian government of all things. Nobody could have seen that coming. Like, who knows what God is able to do and bring forth even through wicked or pagan or non-Christian, whatever term you want to use, systems and infrastructures. If he's truly in control of all things, he can and has surprised us before, and he can do it again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's all part of his plan. And I think this comes back to like part of why I love this podcast is I think, technology is a fundamental part of God's sovereign plan. And it's like, what should we do to lean into the goodness of that plan and be vessels that God will use us, as part of his like broader plan, for what's coming next. So very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Brad Littlejohn recently said, culture is downstream from technology.
That's true.
So let us use tech well. Let us build good tech, find rest, and glorify God. Thanks, everybody, for listening. You can support us on Patreon. You can support us on social media too. You can share this into the algorithm. You can be in the algorithm, but not of the algorithm. Beware of the monster, but help others listen to this and understand some of the complexities that we hoped we still are trying to understand it, but we hope this has helped you, and share it so that you can help others. Take care. Bye.
Bye.